Welcome to your deep dive. Today we're diving into quite the complex figure, Henry Kissinger.
Yeah, you've certainly given me a lot to work with here. Interviews, historical analysis, even some surprising
It's
anecdotes.
an incredible mix, really. I mean, we're talking about someone who operated at the highest levels of power during, well, one of the most consequential periods in American history.
Exactly, not just present for it, but actively shaping those moments. It's a rich portrait, to say the least.
So our mission today is to really try to get to the essence of Kissinger, his strategies, his impact, and all those questions that, his career still raises decades later.
Kind of like Kissinger 101, but hopefully way more engaging than any class you've ever taken.
You got that right.
Yeah.
And speaking of captivating stories, Kissinger's early life is a pretty good place to start.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, born in Germany in 1923.
As a Jewish child.
Right, as a Jewish child under Nazi rule. Just think about that for a second. The impact on his worldview, on his understanding of power, of vulnerability, it's hard to even imagine.
One of the documentaries you sent actually showed those signs, those Judenunterwunsch
Oh,
signs.
wow. I mean, the very air he breathed was hostile.
And we know his parents were deeply affected by the rising anti-Semitism. I mean, their whole world was being turned upside down.
It's fascinating, isn't it, to consider that experience as kind of a foundation?
Yeah.
I mean, did it fuel his later embrace of American society?
Almost like he needed to prove himself within a system that had once rejected him so completely.
Possibly. It's striking, that contrast. I mean, fleeing Nazi Germany to becoming a Harvard professor.
And then, eventually, a key figure in American foreign policy. Talk about a transformation.
From Firth to Harvard to the White House. I mean, it suggests adaptability, ambition, maybe even a deep-seated understanding of how quickly things can change.
How quickly peace can shatter, how power can shift.
Hmm.
Which leads us to that fascinating and at times pretty fraught partnership with President Nixon.
Now, that wasn't exactly a pairing the history books would have predicted. I mean, we're talking about a politician who was wary of intellectuals.
And an academic thrust into the world of realpolitik.
Right. And, one of the sources you sent mentioned that Kissinger initially had a pretty low opinion of Nixon.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he called him provincial, I think, yet he still accepted the role of national security advisor.
Do you think he saw it as an opportunity? To actually influence policy, even if it meant working with someone he didn't fully respect?
It's definitely possible. Kissinger was a pragmatist, after all. And Nixon, despite their differences, well, he held the keys to power.
And all of this was playing out against the backdrop of the Vietnam War. It became a defining moment for both of them, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I mean, Nixon campaigned on ending the war, but under him and Kissinger.
The conflict escalated.
Yeah, in ways no one could have anticipated. And, the secret bombing of Cambodia, that's a prime example of how strategic calculations, can lead to those moral quagmires.
And it's important to remember that Kissinger didn't intend for it to stay secret forever.
Right. He actually planned for a UN investigation if it was discovered.
But it never was, at least not right away.
And so it remained this clandestine operation, further entangling America in the conflict. It's a chilling reminder,
That even the best laid plans can have those unintended consequences.
for sure. And then you have the resignations of some of Kissinger's aides, the ones who, even though they disagreed with the war.
They saw him as the last best hope.
Exactly. It speaks volumes about those moral dilemmas of that era and about Kissinger's ability to inspire, well, both loyalty and dissent.
He was walking a tightrope, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Trying to balance, I don't know, his own personal beliefs with those demands of realpolitik.
And that's a philosophy that really became synonymous with him, didn't it?
Realpolitik. It's more than just a word, though.
It's a framework, really. It's about prioritizing national interest above ideology, and in some cases, even moral concerns.
And there are some pretty stark quotes that really encapsulate this mindset. One that really stood out to me was, "You make every agreement that's to your advantage, and you discard every agreement the moment it ceases to be to your advantage."
Wow. Chilling, isn't it? That quote just lays bare the transactional nature of his thinking. It's about power, self-interest, with very little regard for sentiment.
Another one that struck me, morals have absolutely nothing to do with it. It makes you wonder how he reconciled those beliefs, with his own personal values.
Maybe in his mind, the national interest superseded everything else. It's the question at the heart of understanding Kissinger, isn't it? I mean, was he a man devoid of a moral compass? Or did he believe that nations, operate on a different level than individuals?
And if that's true, what does that say about the cost of power on that world stage?
Exactly. It's a lot to unpack, especially when you start looking at specific examples, like take détente with the Soviet Union, for instance.
That was about more than just managing the Cold War, right?
I think Kissinger saw it as a chance to actually reshape the Soviet system from the inside out. He saw Brezhnev as kind of a precursor to Gorbachev, as someone open to those gradual internal reforms.
So he was playing the long game, using diplomacy, engagement, not just to contain communism, but to transform it.
He believed in dialogue, even with rivals. He saw those cracks in the Soviet facade and he wanted to exploit them, not through aggression, but through strategic engagement.
And then there's the opening to China, 1972. I mean, talk about audacious. A move that completely reshaped the balance of power globally. Was that pure realpolitik?
I think it was a calculated gamble, but one that paid off spectacularly. By forging ties with China, Kissinger, and Nixon, well, they outmaneuvered the Soviets, for one thing, but they also opened up new avenues for American diplomacy and trade.
It showed that realpolitik wasn't just about cynicism. It could be about vision, risk-taking.
Right, and it was a high-stakes risk that paid off. But of course, we can't ignore the controversies that have followed Kissinger throughout his career. We've talked about the successes.
But there's another side to this story.
Exactly, and those controversies are essential because they force us to confront the ethical implications of his actions. I mean, his decisions, especially in Latin America and Southeast Asia, well, they continue to spark debate, raising those tough questions about power, about morality, and the true cost of American foreign policy.
Let's start with Chile. The intervention there and the death of President Allende in '73. A dark chapter that really exemplifies those potential downsides of realpolitik in action.
No doubt about it. Nixon was determined to prevent, as he put it, another Castro in Latin America.
And Allende's socialist government was seen as a direct threat to American interests.
Absolutely. And, Kissinger, even though he claimed to just be following orders, played a central role in coordinating those covert actions to destabilize Allende's government.
He even admitted to helping those striking workers and those opposition groups.
He was a master at working in the shadows, leveraging American influence to achieve those strategic objectives, even if it meant undermining, democratically elected governments.
And then the aftermath. Pinochet's brutal dictatorship. It casts a long shadow over Kissinger's legacy, doesn't it?
It raises those uncomfortable questions about the moral compromises inherent in this approach. Did American interests justify supporting a regime that engaged in such widespread human rights abuses?
And it's worth noting that Kissinger met with Pinochet later, in '76.
I read about that, yeah. He reportedly raised those human rights concerns, but for a lot of people, it just rang hollow. They argue that his involvement in the intervention makes him complicit in the atrocities that followed.
And then there's East Timor, 1975. The material you sent suggests that Kissinger and Ford basically gave the green light to the Indonesian invasion, just hours before it happened.
The timing of that meeting with President Suharto is, it's incredibly damning. It happened right before Ford and Kissinger left Indonesia, and then almost immediately after they left.
The invasion began.
And the transcript of that meeting, it's chilling. Suharto basically asked for their understanding, and Kissinger assured him that they wouldn't press him on it. It's like they knew what was about to happen, and they chose to look the other way.
Another consequence of realpolitik.
The desire to maintain that relationship with Indonesia, a key ally in the region, seemed to outweigh any concern for the people of East Timor.
We can't forget Watergate either, the scandal that brought down Nixon. Kissinger remarkably managed to survive the fallout, but not unscathed.
His office was implicated in that whole wiretapping operation. Journalists, even some of his own aides, it really damaged his image, made people question his judgment, his ethical boundaries.
He even threatened to resign if his character wasn't cleared, but he ended up staying on as Secretary of State under Ford. It makes you wonder what his real priority was.
Protecting his legacy, maybe?
Maybe. And then there's that phone call with Nixon after the resignation. Kissinger apparently destroyed a tape of their conversation. Highly personal, he called it.
What was on that tape, I wonder?
So we've covered a lot of ground. Kissinger's early life, that complex partnership with Nixon, the rise of realpolitik, and all those controversies.
It's a complex story.
More than complex, and we've only just scratched the surface. His influence on American foreign policy, those debates about his actions, and, the relevance of his ideas today. Well, that's all still to come.
Kissinger's impact, I mean, it's undeniable. Whether you see him as, a visionary strategist or a ruthless pragmatist, his fingerprints are all over American foreign policy.
Decades worth of influence. It's like his realpolitik approach became, I don't know, the default setting, the lens through which America viewed its role in the world.
It really did. It wasn't just about policies, it was a shift in mindset. That focus on national interests, those power dynamics, the strategic calculations above all else. That's the Kissingerian legacy in a nutshell, really.
But legacies, I mean, they're rarely simple.
Yeah.
What are some of those tangible successes,
Yeah.
the positive outcomes? We can attribute to this realpolitik approach.
Well, some argue that it was key in ending the Cold War. His willingness to engage, even with rivals, to find that common ground while competing, I mean, that was huge in managing those tense years.
And the opening to China is a perfect example, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
that wouldn't have happened without that willingness to kind of break from that traditional thinking, seeing opportunity where others only saw danger.
Absolutely. It was bold, a calculated risk, but it reshaped that global landscape. And it wasn't just about containing the Soviet Union. It was about recognizing those shifting tides of power, positioning America to navigate them.
Realpolitik wasn't just cynicism. It was about vision, that willingness to play the long game.
Exactly. But then there's the other side of the coin, the potential downsides. And they're significant. I mean, they're woven throughout the material you shared.
The moral compromises, the unintended consequences, that tendency to, I don't know, prioritize short-term gains over long-term stability, they're all valid criticisms.
The Chile intervention is a stark example of that. I mean, realpolitik in that instance led to the support of a brutal dictatorship. The repercussions of that decision echoed for decades.
And East Timor, the desire to maintain that strategic relationship with Indonesia, it just outweighed any concern for the human cost.
Right. It makes you ask, at what point does pragmatism cross the line, become moral bankruptcy? When does pursuing national interest become an excuse to just, ignore suffering?
It's a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
This realpolitik, incredibly effective at achieving goals, but that potential for collateral damage is always there. Those ethical considerations, I mean, you just can't avoid them.
And these aren't abstract debates either. They have real implications for how we understand American foreign policy today. I mean, as we grapple with those ghosts of interventions past Vietnam, Iraq.
It's like Kissinger's career, all the controversies, forces us to confront these fundamental questions. What are the limits of American power? When is intervention justified? Morality, what role should that play?
Questions every administration has to grapple with. No easy answers. Kissinger's legacy reminds us that every foreign policy decision has trade-off. There's always potential for blowback. And that line between good intentions and, disastrous outcomes, it can be incredibly thin.
So where does that leave us today? Is realpolitik, I mean, it was born in the Cold War, is it still relevant in our world, our complex, interconnected world?
That's the question, isn't it? The world's changed drastically since Kissinger's time. I mean, we're facing climate change, pandemics, cyber warfare, things that don't really fit into those traditional power politics.
But we're still living in a world of conflict, of competition, nations vying for influence.
And some argue that realpolitik, despite its flaws, it's still necessary. A way to navigate a world where self-interest often trumps idealism.
Still wrestling with the ghost of Kissinger, huh? Trying to figure out what's applicable to the 21st century and what needs to be left behind.
Exactly. That's what makes this whole deep dive so compelling. It's not just about the past, it's about the present and the future.
So as we're wrapping up this exploration, what are some takeaways for our listeners, insights they can, take with them?
Well, first, Kissinger's life, I mean, it shows how even the most influential figures, they're shaped by their personal experiences. His childhood, that journey to America, it impacted his whole worldview, his approach to power.
Right. And realpolitik,
Yeah.
for all its potential, often comes with that moral price tag. Chile, East Timor, they're reminders that putting national interest above all else, I mean, it can have devastating consequences.
And third, Kissinger's legacy isn't simple. Brilliant strategist, master of diplomacy, but also deeply controversial.
His actions are still debated,
Yeah.
still scrutinized all these years later.
They are. And finally, the questions his career raises, they're relevant today. We face new challenges, but we have to ask, what can we learn from his successes and failures? How do we balance those interests with our responsibilities to the wider world?
Excellent points. A lot to think about. It seems like this deep dive's given you a lot to consider.
It really has, seeing Kissinger in a whole new light. And it's left me with this lingering question. What if he was advising a president today? In our world, what would his playbook even look like?
Would he be urging caution, restraint, in a world that feels like it's constantly teetering on the edge? Or would he still be pushing for those bold moves to secure American dominance, even if it bent the rules?
Hard to say, but knowing his approach, I doubt he'd shy away from using every tool at his disposal.
To advance American interests.
Exactly. And he wouldn't be afraid to challenge conventional thinking, finding those unconventional solutions even if they were unpopular or morally ambiguous.
Imagine him advising on climate change. Would he see it as an environmental issue or a geopolitical one?
Knowing Kissinger, he'd see it as both. Completely intertwined, he'd be looking for ways to leverage American influence, shaping the global response, securing advantages, even within a framework of cooperation.
Multidimensional chess, thinking several moves ahead, anticipating reactions, always with that goal of maximizing American power.
Precisely. And he wouldn't be bound by ideology, working with anyone, even former adversaries, if it served American interest. The core of realpolitik, isn't it? That pragmatic approach.
But it brings us right back to those ethical dilemmas. When does pragmatism become that slippery slope? Where's the line between pursuing our interests and upholding our values?
Those are the tough questions, and I don't think there are easy answers. But they're questions that everyone, every leader, every citizen has to grapple with, especially in a world like ours.
Maybe that's the real takeaway from this Kissinger deep dive. It's not about agreeing or disagreeing with his methods. It's about understanding them, the forces that shaped his worldview and that lasting impact.
Well said. The intricacies of power, the weight of history, those moral dilemmas.
Exactly. It leaves our listeners with a lot to ponder.
I hope so. The goal is to spark that curiosity, to encourage critical thinking, to leave them wanting to explore these issues on their own.
That's the essence of these deep dives, right? At Spark. And giving them the tools, the insights to help them navigate history and today's challenges.
It is. And who knows, maybe someday one of our listeners will be the one shaping history, making those tough decisions, grappling with those same dilemmas.
And maybe, just maybe, they'll do so with a better understanding of those forces at play, the lessons of the past, that immense responsibility that comes with power.
I hope so. It's a responsibility that shouldn't be taken lightly.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Henry Kissinger. It's been a journey.
It really has. Fascinating, unsettling.
An exploration of power, diplomacy, those legacies of the 20th century.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
Makes you wonder if that's the real legacy, right?
Right.
Not just the policies themselves, but the questions he makes us ask all these years later.
For sure. It's like he threw this massive rock into the pond of history. And those ripples, they're still spreading, affecting how we see power, diplomacy, America's place in the world.
And those ripples, they touch everything, from rising tensions with other nations to those global challenges, climate change, terrorism.
Yeah. We were just talking about climate change, weren't we? It's fascinating to think how he'd approach a problem that goes beyond those traditional geopolitical boundaries.
He wouldn't just see it as an environmental issue, would he? Knowing Kissinger, he'd be looking for the leverage, the opportunities to, advance those American interests, even within a crisis.
Oh, absolutely. It would be a strategy game to him, wouldn't it? Anticipating moves, seeking alliances, always looking to position America as the leader, the one with the solutions.
That relentless pragmatism, that willingness to operate in those, those gray areas, to make the tough choices that others just wouldn't.
And that's what makes him so fascinating to study. He forces us to confront those truths about power. It's rarely pure, is it? There are always those trade-offs. And national interest. Sometimes it comes at a human cost.
He reminds us that history is messy. The lines get blurred. Even the best intentions can go wrong.
They can. And that's the point of this deep dive, really. Not to judge him. It's to understand him. To see those forces that shaped his worldview and the impact. It's lasting.
It's about asking ourselves those questions. About power, about morality, and the choices we face as a nation on the world stage.
Exactly. And those choices are never easy, are they? Always competing interests. And those decisions made by those in power, they have those ripple effects that can last for generations.
We've definitely given our listeners a lot to think about. I hope it inspires them to keep exploring these issues, keep asking those questions, to keep digging deeper.
I hope so too. That's what these deep dives are for. Sparking curiosity, encouraging them to think critically, to help them engage with history and what's happening in the world today in a way that's more informed.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of Henry Kissinger. It's been fascinating, unsettling at times,
It has been a journey.
an exploration of power, of diplomacy, the legacy of the 20th century.
And those questions that still resonate today.
They do. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, keep diving deep.
And we'll be here to help guide the way.